Okay, so you want to own an orchard, neat rows of trees running to the horizon, a wooden ladder leaned into a branch heavy with fruit, crates stacked in the shade, the smell of cut grass and ripening apples drifting across a gravel driveway with a hand painted sign at the end of it. That picture is real. It exists right now on thousands of properties across this country, and it's not a bad thing to want. It's just not the business. Here's the problem: the tree is not your business. The tree is a 15-year bet worth tens of thousands of dollars an acre on what a piece of fruit will be worth on a day you cannot predict, wearing a grade you do not fully control, sold into a market someone else sets. Here's where most people stop thinking: right at the tree. There's a hidden system sitting underneath every orchard in America, and it decides who gets rich growing fruit and who goes broke growing the exact same fruit on the exact same soil in the exact same year. It is not a farm. It is a 15-year construction loan that happens to grow leaves. And once you understand that, everything else about this business, the years of nothing, the sudden explosion of cost at harvest, the check that arrives for less than you expected, starts to make sense. This isn't a business where you plant something in spring and sell it in fall, the way a row crop farmer does. You are building a piece of biological infrastructure that won't reach full output for the better part of a decade, financing it the entire time with debt or savings, and hoping the market it eventually sells into looks anything like the one you planned around. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly what determines whether your fruit is worth 4 times as much as your neighbor's, and why that has almost nothing to do with how good a farmer either of you is. Let's start with what it actually costs to plant one, because orchard is doing a lot of work as a word. There isn't one type, there are several, and each one is a different capital structure wearing the same straw hat. The modern default for commercial apples is a high density trellised system, dwarf trees packed in tight, trained up wire like grapevines, bearing fruit within a few years instead of a decade. That system runs roughly $26,578 an acre to establish, all in, according to Michigan State's 2025 cost of production study. Step down to a semi dwarf system: fewer trees per acre, no trellis wire, a slower ramp to full production, and the same acre costs closer to $7,676 to get in the ground. A separate cost study out of North Carolina puts a slender spindle high density system at $8,365 an acre and a plain central leader system at $3,759, confirming the same basic shape. Density costs money upfront and buys you speed later. The trade off underneath those numbers is the entire decision. The expensive high density system with the trellis wire reaches full production years faster. Some comparisons show it hitting its yield ceiling by year 6 or 7 versus year 13 for the cheap, old fashioned central leader planting. So the low sticker price on the old style system is misleading in the same way the cheap Wyoming ranch land was misleading. You save money going in, and you pay for it in years of waiting that the expensive system never asks you for. Stone fruit, peaches, cherries follows the same logic on a shorter, riskier timeline because the trees themselves don't last as long and are more disease prone. Nut orchards, pecans, walnuts, almonds follow it on a much longer one, sometimes a decade or more, before a tree is fully mature. And a dedicated cider or juice orchard is planted with the bottom of the market already priced in, using rougher, cheaper varieties nobody ever expects to sell as fresh fruit at all. Different bet, same skeleton. You are always trading cash today for years later in one direction or the other. Now, here's the cost almost nobody prices in before they plant, and it has a formula behind it, not a guess. If you're in hail country, and a lot of good orchard ground is, a permanent netting canopy over the block runs $18,000 to $35,000 per hectare, or roughly $7,300 to $14,200 an acre installed. About half of that is the steel and wire support structure. A quarter is the net fabric itself. The last quarter is labor to hang it. And here's the catch: the cheaper net types last 5 to 8 years before they need full replacement. Only the pricier woven type gets past a decade, So the sky over your orchard isn't a one time purchase. It's a recurring capital line that shows up again every 5 to 10 years for as long as you own the property, whether or not a single hailstorm ever actually hits. Stack it all up: land, whatever it costs in your part of the country; trees, at roughly $11.50 a piece for dwarf rootstock, with something like 1,210 of them going into a single high density acre. Call it $14,000 in trees alone before a single post goes into the ground to hold them up, trellis wire, and posts to keep those trees standing once they're loaded with fruit, irrigation to get water to them through a dry July. And if you want the crop protected once all of that is finally producing, the netting on top of it. Before a single piece of fruit is ready to sell, an all in high density acre can run anywhere from $15,000 to well over $40,000 before land. And that's the cheap part of this business, because the expensive part hasn't even started yet. The expensive part is waiting. Now let's get to the part of this business that actually explains everything else. Here's a thought experiment: two orchards, same soil, same rainfall, same 40,000 pounds of apples harvested off the same acreage this October. Which one makes more money? Most people's instinct is they're identical. Same fruit, same weight, same money. Here's the problem with that instinct: it's wrong, and it's wrong by a factor of about four. What actually determines an orchard's income isn't how many pounds you grew, it's what grade those pounds fall into. Nationally, fresh apples, the ones that go into a bag at the grocery store, make up about 70% of the crop's total volume, but they account for about 90% of the crop's total value. Read that again: 70% of the volume, 90% of the money, which means the other 30% of the harvest, the apples that get diverted into juice and processing, earns only 10% of the money. Do the arithmetic on that. 90 divided by 70 gives fresh fruit a value share of roughly 1.29 times the average pound. 10 divided by 30 gives processing fruit a value share of roughly 0.33 times the average pound. Divide one by the other, and you get almost 4. Fresh grade fruit is worth roughly 4 times as much, pound for pound, as processing grade fruit, off the exact same tree in the exact same season. Ground that in real dollars. In recent seasons, growers needed something like $28 to $44 for a 40-pound box of fresh fruit just to cover their costs. Call that 70 cents to $1.10 a pound. Processing apples the same year were trading around $135 to $400 a ton. Call that 7 to 20 cents a pound. On the low end of that spread, you're looking at a 5 to 1 gap. On the high end, closer to 10 to 1. Same tree, same water, same fertilizer bill. The only difference is what the fruit looked like when it hit the sorting line. And here's the structural conclusion: the tree does not know or care what grade its fruit will end up as. Grading runs on things like size, color, and the presence or absence of a single russet mark or bruise the size of a fingernail. Cosmetic categories that have almost nothing to do with how the apple tastes or how much water and labor went into growing it. A cold snap during bloom, a hailstorm in July, a bruise from an inexperienced picker's thumb, 1 degree of temperature difference in the 2 weeks before harvest. Any one of those can push a piece of fruit from the top of the value ladder to the bottom after every dollar of growing cost has already been spent on it either way. You are not really farming pounds, you are farming a grading system. And most of what determines your income for the entire year happens in a window of a few weeks you don't fully control. So here's the problem. Now, here's where it gets dangerous, because the grading outcome sits at the end of a calendar that runs all year, every year, whether or not anything is being harvested. Winter is dormant pruning, shaping every tree by hand for next year's crop, labor intensive, with no revenue anywhere near it. Spring is bloom, and bloom is the single highest leverage week of the entire year, because it's when pollination sets how much fruit you even have a chance of harvesting. Early summer is thinning, deliberately pulling young, perfectly healthy fruit off the tree on purpose. So the fruit that remains gets more of the tree's energy and grows bigger, sweeter, and better graded by fall. It feels wrong the first time you do it, throwing away fruit you paid to grow. It's also one of the highest return decisions you'll make all season, because the alternative is a tree loaded with small, cheap, poorly graded apples instead of fewer, valuable ones. Then, a spray program runs through the growing season to protect against insects and disease on a schedule that doesn't pause for anything. Then harvest hits all at once in the fall, a labor spike that dwarfs every other month of the year. Revenue arrives once at the end of that calendar. Costs arrive as every single week of it. Now, here's where it gets dangerous. And this is a cost almost nobody outside the industry has ever thought about because most people don't know your trees don't pollinate themselves. Growers rent bees. There's a formula behind it, roughly one hive per 1,000 pounds of fruit you're hoping to harvest, at $60 to $70 a hive, because only 5 to 10% of the blossoms on the tree actually need to get pollinated to set a full crop. Sounds efficient. Here's the catch: a strong hive, 10 to 12 frames of brood, roughly 40,000 bees, and a weak hive, 6 frames, 15,000 bees, often rent for close to the same price. And as one longtime beekeeping columnist puts it, 2 weak hives will never equal one strong hive. Most growers never crack a single box open to check, and bees don't fly and don't pollinate below about 55 degrees. So if the 10 days of bloom happen to land during a cold snap, which is not an unusual thing for a spring in fruit country, you can pay for a full pollination contract, get exactly the hives you ordered, and still end up with a partial crop. There is no refund clause for weather. On top of that recurring seasonal grind, layer on the fixed costs. Labor now runs roughly 60% of total operating costs on a modern orchard, up from around 45% back in 2009. Wages in the $18 to $24 an hour range, times every hour of pruning, thinning, spraying, and picking across the calendar. Harvest labor alone runs $71 a bin for a high value variety like Honeycrisp, $45 a bin for a mid value variety like Gala, and $35 a bin even for fruit headed straight to processing, meaning the labor cost to pick a bin of fruit can run twice as high depending purely on which variety is hanging on the tree before you've sold a single apple off of it. And there's a regulatory cost line that hits small growers hardest of all: federal produce safety compliance, water testing, worker training, record keeping can run an estimated 6% of total production value on a very small operation, but only about 1% on a large one. The paperwork costs roughly the same in absolute dollars either way. It's just a much bigger bite out of a much smaller check, which means the regulatory floor of this business quietly favors whoever is already large. There's a structural fork sitting underneath all of this, and it's the one Beat 6 is about to make painfully real. Whether you commit your fruit to a processing contract for a guaranteed lower price or sell into the fresh market for a higher, far more volatile one. Growers who lock in a processing contract sleep better in a bad year and make less in a good one. Growers who chase the fresh market make more in a good year and absorb the full force of a bad one. Neither choice is wrong, but whichever one you pick, you've picked which kind of risk you're carrying, not whether you're carrying any. Let's talk about what can go wrong, because the honest answer is it already has, twice in the last few years, in ways that had nothing to do with anyone being lazy or greedy. Start with Washington State, the single largest apple growing region in the country, the place that grows something like 2 out of every 3 apples sold fresh in America. Between 2017 and 2022, 187 Washington apple farms closed. Roughly 2,335 remain today, farming about 188,000 acres, worth around $2 billion a year at the crop level. The causes stack. They didn't strike all at once, which is exactly why it took years for anyone to call it a crisis, instead of just a rough patch. In 2018, tariffs cut off major export markets in India and China. The share of the Washington crop sold overseas dropped from around a third to around a quarter, which meant an extra 310 million pounds a year had to find a home in the domestic market instead, pushing supply up and prices down right when costs were climbing. Labor's share of operating cost, remember, climbed from 45% to 60% over that same stretch. And the price growers actually got paid barely moved, about 34 cents a pound in the 1990s, adjusted for inflation, versus about 27 cents a pound in 2023. Costs went up, the price didn't. Nobody in that chain made a single bad decision in any one year. The trap was that every decision looked reasonable in isolation, and the years just kept adding up in the wrong direction. Here's the number that makes it real. One grower's newest planting, a block of Cosmic Crisp, a premium variety bred specifically to command a premium price, cost roughly $150,000 to plant. In 2023, at the bottom of an oversupply cycle, that variety was returning as little as $6.95 per 900-pound bin at the farm gate. That same volume of fruit at retail was worth something like $2,691. Read that again. $6.95 to the grower, $2,691 at the store, $150,000 to plant it in the first place. That's not a business failing because nobody wanted apples. That's a business where the math connecting what it costs to grow the fruit and what the fruit is actually paid for simply broke for one season at exactly the wrong time. The second one is smaller, stranger, and in some ways more unsettling because it isn't about weather or tariffs at all. In 2026, S. Martinelli and Company, the juice and cider company, ended supply contracts with apple growers in California's Pajaro Valley, relationships that in some cases had run for more than a century. Dozens of growers were affected, and here's the detail that should stop you. Local California apples were fetching around $400 a ton in 2024, nearly 3 times what Washington apples were bringing at roughly $135 a ton. Proximity, quality, 100 years of relationship, none of it mattered because Martinelli simply chose to source its fruit somewhere cheaper. Growers responded by bulldozing trees to plant berries instead, or pivoting to selling directly to customers. Some of them, it turned out, had already been quietly building a farm stand or a U-Pick weekend on the side, and that second stream was the only reason a Martinelli's contract cancellation didn't end their farm outright. The structural lesson isn't that the growers did anything wrong. It's that a buyer relationship, even a century-old one, is still just a contract, and a contract can end on someone else's schedule, not yours. So, how does an orchard actually make money in plain mechanical terms once you strip out the drama? Fixed costs divided by revenue per unit gives you your break even. Using Michigan's 2025 figures for a high density block, if you're growing a mid value variety like Gala or Fuji at a solid 1,200 bushels an acre, you need a dock price. What the packing house actually pays you after trucking of about $163 a bin just to cover your cash and depreciation costs. Growing a premium variety like Honeycrisp at 1,000 bushels an acre pushes that break even up to about $211 a bin because the higher value trees cost more to grow in the first place, and you're spreading those costs across fewer bins per acre. Let that sit for a second. The premium variety, the one everyone assumes is the better bet, actually needs a higher price just to break even, not a lower one. As one group of WSU economists flatly put it, for the commodity end of this business, a price below $30 a box simply is not sustainable. Here's how long it takes to get there. Across the cost studies that track this, a high density block typically reaches positive cash flow somewhere around year 5 or 6, meaning the money coming in from that year's harvest finally covers that year's operating cost. That is not the same thing as being paid back. Full recovery of everything spent to establish it. Every dollar of trees, trellis, irrigation, and labor poured in before the block ever produced a marketable crop takes closer to year 12. That's a decade plus of capital sitting in the ground before it's fully repaid itself, on top of the 4 to 6 years before it produces anything worth selling at all. For most of your first decade of owning an orchard, you are financially underwater on paper, even in years where the harvest itself technically turns a profit. And then there's the treadmill underneath even that. A high density trellis system has a practical economic lifespan of around 15 years before growers typically choose to tear it out and replant to newer, higher value varieties, while a slower central leader system can run closer to 20. Do the math on what that means. You spend 5 or 6 years getting to positive cash flow. You spend until roughly year 12 fully recovering what you put in. And by year 15, on the faster system, you're already looking at the decision to tear it all out and start the 15-year clock over again. That's not growth. That's a construction loan you refinance every decade and a half forever. This is why so many orchard owners eventually add a second stream that doesn't run through the packing house at all. A farm stand, a U-Pick weekend, a cider press. Nationally, agritourism revenue grew from around $704 million dollars in 2012 to roughly $950 million dollars in 2017. It's real money, and unlike wholesale fruit, the price is set by you, not by a dock sheet in another state, but it comes with a real ceiling. It only works on a fraction of your acreage. It's seasonal. It depends on customers willing to drive out to you on a specific weekend, and it carries its own weather risk stacked directly on top of the crop risk you're already carrying. A rained out Saturday in October doesn't just cost you a day of picking, it costs you the only day some of those customers were ever going to show up. It softens the swing. It doesn't replace the core business, and it never fully escapes the thing the core business runs on. So let's put the two futures side by side because this is where the honest math actually lives. In the optimistic scenario, your high density gala block hits its target yield of 1,200 bushels an acre right on schedule. The market's tight that year, and your dock price comes in around $190 to $210 a bin, comfortably above your $163 break even. You reach positive cash flow on the normal 5 to 6 year timeline. The bees showed up during a warm bloom week and did their job. This is a genuinely good business in a good year. In the realistic scenario, nothing dramatic happens at all. That's the point. Bloom week happens to land during a cold snap, and bees mostly don't fly below 55 degrees. So fruit set comes in a little under target. Not a disaster, just a little light. Because the crop is a little lighter and a little more stressed by that cold snap, the pack out skews a little further toward processing grade than fresh grade. Remember, that's a roughly 4 to 1 swing in value on every pound that slides down a grade. It's an oversupply year, too, like the ones this industry has had repeatedly in the last few seasons. And the dock price drifts back down toward or just under that $163 break even. Labor costs keep climbing, the way they have been for over a decade now. No fire, no scandal, just a slightly colder bloom week, a slightly lower pack out, a slightly oversupplied market, and a slightly heavier labor bill, compounding quietly across the same 12 months as the optimistic version. The gap between those two ordinary years on a mid sized block can run tens of thousands of dollars without a single headline worthy event to explain where it went. The parking lot outside the packing shed looks about the same either way. The number at the bottom of the ledger doesn't. The orchard was never a farm. It was a 15-year construction loan, and the trees were always just the building, quietly compounding, whether or not you ever go out and admire the view from inside it.